September 25, 2003, New York. Prime Minister's address at the 58th session of United Nations General Assembly. We congratulate you on your election to the presidency of the 58th session of the UN General Assembly. We wish you every success in our shared endeavors. You will have our fullest cooperation in your efforts. As we gather here in the wake of many momentous events over the past year, it is inevitable that we ponder on some fundamental questions about the role and relevance of the United Nations. The United Nations was charged by its chapter and charter to save the succeeding generations from the scourge of war. The Charter also speaks of our collective determination to unite, strengthen, to maintain international peace and security. There was an implicit conviction that the United Nations would be stronger than the sum total of its constituent member states. Its unique legitimacy flows from a universal perception that it pursues a larger purpose than the interest of any one country or a small group of countries. This vision of an enlightened multilateralism has not materialized. There have been difficulties and deficiencies in ensuring a world free from strife, a world without war. The United Nations has not always been successful in preventing conflicts or in resolving them. During the past year, the United Nations have encountered further new challenges. We saw the extraordinary inability of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council to agree on action in respect of Iraq, in spite of complete agreement on the basic objectives. Most recently, the brutal terrorist attack on the United Nations office in Baghdad struck a body blow at the UN's humanitarian efforts there. Looking back at the events over the recent years, we can analyze the successes and failures of the United Nations in this or that crisis. But it would be more purposeful to reflect on our own commitments to the multilateralism, the extent of its applicability in the real world of today, and the manner in which it can be exercised through United Nations. The reality is that the international institutions like the UN can only be as effective as its members allow it to be. Our reflection on the United Nations focus on 3 key aspects. First, we need to introspect on some of the assumptions that have been made over the years on the will and reach of the United Nations. In the euphoria after the Cold War, there was a misplaced notion that the United Nations could solve every problem anywhere. Its enthusiasm and proactive stance on many issues reflected laudable intentions. But we soon realized that the United Nations does not possess the magical powers to solve every crisis in all parts of the globe, or to change overnight the motivation of leaders and the communities around the world. We need to clearly recognize with a sense of realism the limits to which the United Nations can achieve and the changes of form and function required for it to play an optimal role in today's world. Second, the Iraq issue has inevitably generated a debate on the functioning and the efficacy of the Security Council and that of United Nations itself. Over the decades, the UN membership has grown enormously. The scope of the activities have expanded greatly with the new specialized agencies and new programs. But in the political and security dimensions of its activities, the United Nations has not kept pace with the changes in the world. For the Security Council to represent genuine multilateralism in its decisions and actions, its membership must reflect current world realities. Most UN members today recognize the need for an enlarged and restructured Security Council with more developing countries as permanent members and non permanent members. The permanent members guard their exclusivity. Some states with weak claims want to ensure that others do not enter the Council as permanent members. This combination of complacency and negativism has to be countered with a strong political will. The recent crisis warn us that until the UN Security Council is formed and reformed and restructured, its decisions cannot reflect truly the collective will of the communities of nations. Third, even after such reform, the Security Council would have to evolve suitable decision making mechanisms which ensure better representations of collective will of the international community. How can multilateralism be genuinely implemented? A single veto is an anachronism in today's world. On the other hand, the requirement of unanimity can sabotage imperative actions. A simple majority vote may not be sufficiently representative for major issues of gravity. Should we aim for the highest common factor or should we settle for the lowest common denominator? National experiences in the democratic countries provide unstable, usable models of mechanisms which could specify the extent of support required depending on the impact of actions to be taken. The Secretary General has rightly emphasized the urgency of the reform of the institutions and processes of the United Nations. We encourage his efforts in this direction. We should seek to implement these reforms within a specified time frame. The Iraq issue continues to present a major challenge to United Nations. At this point of time, it is not very productive to linger on the past. Our thoughts and concerns should be about the sufferings of people of Iraq. It is imperative that the people of Iraq should be empowered to determine their own future, to rebuild their nation. The immediate priorities are ensuring security and stability, restoration of basic facilities and infrastructure, and a roadmap of political process for a representative Iraqi government. It is clear that the United Nations has a crucial role to play in the process of political and economic reconstruction of the country. This has been acknowledged both by those who had opposed military action and by those who did not seek specific UN endorsement for it. One issue on which the UN showed remarkable unanimity after 9/11 was the global terrorism. Security Council Resolution 1373 and 1456 were unequivocal in condemning all forms of terrorism and in calling for united actions against support, shelter, sponsorship, arming, training, finances for terrorism or terrorists. Unfortunately, the solidarity in words have not translated into coherent and effective action. Terrorist acts continue to shatter our peace from Mombasa to Moscow, from Baghdad to Bali. India has had more than its share in various parts of the country. The global coalition against terrorism has registered success in Afghanistan but has not been able to extend it elsewhere. Some of its members are themselves part of the problem. We are sometimes led into semantics about the definition of terrorism. The search for the root cause or the imaginary freedom struggles provides alibis for the killing of innocent men, women, and children. There is a lot that the UN can do to carry forward the war against international terrorism. Its counter-terrorism committee should develop measures to ensure compliance by member states of their obligations under UNSCR 1373 and 1456. We should have credible multilateral instruments to identify states that contravene the resolutions. Multilateral mechanisms must be created to detect and choke off international financial flows to terrorists and the terrorist organizations. A much better international system of information exchange and intelligence sharing need to be devised to prevent terrorists from evading capture simply by crossing national borders. No state should be allowed to profess partnership with the global coalition against terrorism while continuing to aid, abet, and sponsor terrorism. To condone such a double standard is to contribute to multiplying terrorism. Yesterday, the President of Pakistan chose this august assembly to make a public admission for the first time that Pakistan is sponsoring terrorism in Jammu and Kashmir. After claiming that there is an indigenous struggle in Kashmir, he has offered to encourage a general cessation of violence within Kashmir in return for reciprocal obligations and restraints. We totally refuse to let terrorism become a tool of blackmail. Just as the world did not negotiate with Al Qaeda or Taliban, we shall not negotiate with terrorism. If we do so, we would be betraying the people of Jammu and Kashmir who defied a most ferocious campaign of violence and intimidation sponsored from across our borders and participated in an election which has been universally hailed as free and fair. This was an unequivocal expression of both determination and self-determination. When the cross-border terrorism stops or when we eradicate it, we can have a dialogue with Pakistan on the other issues between us. While on this subject, I would also like to point out that the President of Pakistan that he should not confuse the legitimate aspirations for equality of nations with outmoded concepts of military parity. We should be particularly concerned at the various recent revelations about clandestine transfers of weapons of mass destruction and their technologies. We face the frightening prospect of these weapons and technologies falling into the hands of terrorists. Surely something also needs to be done about the helplessness of international regimes in preventing such transactions which clearly threaten international security. The same regimes expend considerable energy in imposing a variety of discriminatory technology denial restrictions on responsible states. Our preoccupation with terrorism should not dilute our commitment to tackle the non military threats to human and international security. We have to sustain the fight against trafficking in narcotic drugs, human beings, and small arms. The pandemic of HIV, AIDS, diseases like malaria, tuberculosis that grip developing countries, and the degradation of our common environment. Food security, energy security, and health security are important goals. The countries of the North and of the South, the developed, developing, and the transition economies must resume their dialogue to build a better world for the present and for the future generations. For the agenda of globalization, Cancun was a disappointment. Significant progress was made at Johannesburg during realization of a sustainable development, but entry into force of Kyoto Protocol on climate change remains stalled. The Biodiversity Convention has not yielded any tangible benefits to the world's poor. International economic relations continue to be characterized by the inequalities and inequities. Globalization has helped sections of the international economy, including some developing countries. However, large communities have been left outside its pale. It is endangered economic crisis and instability in some other developing countries which have sharply increased poverty. Poverty is multidimensional. It extends beyond money, income to educate, healthcare, skill enhancement, political participation at all levels, from the local to global, access to natural resources, clean water and air, and advancement of one's own culture and social organization. Poverty alleviation requires resource on a far greater scale than now available. Globalization itself constraints developing countries' governments in raising public responses for poverty alleviation. The promise of the climate change and the biodiversity treaties to raise significant resources for investment and technology transfer is yet unrealized. The resources of multilateral and bilateral development agencies are limited by failure of industrialized countries to enhance development budgets. Therefore, if the current regimes of globalization and sustainable developments are to be expanded or even to survive, they must be directly harnessed to provide the necessary resources for poverty alleviation. In fact, all international agreements and initiatives affecting the developing countries have to be evaluated by their impact on poverty. Developing countries need to coordinate their positions in international negotiations to promote the adoption of regimes which would help poverty alleviation. The India Brazil South Africa Dialogue Forum, which was established earlier this year, is an effort in this direction. We in the developing countries do not have the luxury of time. Political compulsions force us to meet the aspirations of our people quickly, even as we subject ourselves to newer and more rigid international standards and norms. We owe it to our future generations to make strong efforts to make millennium development goals. There is multituality of interest in this between the developed and the developing countries. Global interdependence today means that economic disasters in developing countries could create a backlash on the developed countries. We hope the world will act in this spirit of enlightened self interest. Thank you.